I just want people to understand that. These people might just come from a naturalistic assumption. And of course, they're going to find natural ways of explaining things. They're not putting the text first, they're putting their assumption first and then interpreting. Rather, it should be, let's look at the text first and then see what happens.
Episode 6.
Wow. 6 in like a week and a half. That's me. I don't just do things, I do them.
Good morning, love. Podcast today?
That is true. I am very obsessed with the podcast life right now. So today I want to just maybe talk about two things. I think the first thing that I want to talk about is the title of our podcast.
Ooh, yes.
And then number two, some of the things that I've just been thinking about when it comes to objections to our faith, and some of the things that I've been just researching and thinking through, and I would like to process them here. So the first thing is the name of our podcast, which is, we call it the Us podcast, the Us podcast.
So good.
And the reason why we call it the Us podcast is because I want this podcast to just be about us. And I know that might sound pretty selfish or like self-absorbed. And that's something that I've been going through lately, especially when I've been prioritizing my spiritual health above other things. Probably actually the most important thing in my life, which is prioritizing my spiritual health, even above our relationship. I know that might sound bad, even above our relationship, even above anything, even church, anything, just prioritizing my spiritual health. And it's been so good to me and good for me. And because I've been doing that, I feel like I was able to pour out and serve, and maybe not serve as much because of some transitions. And I feel so much more joyful. I feel like I have so much more to give because I'm filled this way. And so going off this theme of just focusing on my spiritual health, and I've shared this before, maybe I've shared it in this podcast as well, is that the most selfish sounding, unselfish belief that everybody should hold is the belief that we need to prioritize our spiritual health above all things. And that's something that I've been living out, and it's been pretty transformative, and it's been so good for my soul. And I wanted this podcast to go along this theme, and I don't want to ever lose sight of that. I don't ever want to lose sight of this focus on myself first, and then on my spiritual health, and then our relationship. And I wanted to just be natural. I didn't want an agenda. I didn't want it to feel like work. We already work. And I don't want it to feel like work. I want it to be something that we truly look forward to, and we just truly just enjoy. And that's why I think it's just gonna be just us. And as much as we do like the camera thing and we need to introduce our friends. Wait, which one? What's yours?
So this is Fred.
Fred. And maybe I'll call...
It's up to your discretion.
Call it Jen.
Jen?
I don't know why Jen.
I feel like he's like a Dave.
A Dave? Okay.
I will go with Jen.
Okay,
I named one, so
I
you name
like Dave. I like Dave. Fred and Dave are our...
He has a derpy look.
Our light friends, I guess. Bree brought this, Dave, and I love Dave. He's becoming my friend. And so yeah, I just I want it to feel natural, and I don't want to produce things. Like, I don't want this podcast to be for other people. I don't want to have like, oh, this is a goal that I have. Like, this is like information I want to give to the world or anything like that. That just seems so much work to me. And I like have to prepare, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't want to do that. I just wanted to talk about what we're passionate about, what we're processing at the moment, what we're thinking through, what we're growing through. And that's honestly what I really want this podcast to be about. And it's just going to be about us. And yeah.
Yeah.
And then we have the second part of the reason. But before I go into that, wanted to open it up for you.
Yeah. I just first want to say thank you for thinking about that. I know we've been like praying and like just waiting it out to see like what it could be. And I love that heart and like idea of like, I guess to like follow up with your like thinking of like your spiritual health and like your spiritual walk. I think it can also be defined as like your relationship with God, right? And then so that is like your priority, which is why the second reason for the name is it's faith-based and Bible-based. And then I think too is like it's like first relationship with God, and then it's us. And so I think that's very like healing of like, oh, this is like something for us and we're building, and this time is like a time to like share our hearts and discuss, have fun. And so I just love that aspect of it. It's like, oh, like it's fun and it's also meaningful and it doesn't feel like work sometimes the uploads, but we're getting better
Oh
at
yeah,
it.
the uploads.
But it's not like something to we're beating our heads over. And I think the external views or like the comments are just more like validation of like, oh, what you guys are doing is very like admirable. But I like the thing I love most is like us, like we are the center, like we are the, oh, maybe that sounds so like,
No, we
it's
are
because
the
it's about us. I like it. Yeah, but it hits like a soft spot in my heart of like, you know, our relationship I've brought up many times, like I just want to feel prioritized. Like that's like one of my greatest needs and desires. And so I feel like this is a way to express and be filled by that statement. So yeah, I love that.
Yeah, and as much as I want to like prioritize you and I want that to be super important, that sounds so bad. I think it was like that wasn't even the goal. Like it wasn't like, oh, I want Bree to feel prioritized.
Yeah.
Therefore, I want to do this podcast because I think that I might have sound bad, but I think that could be another like thing that I have to do. And I think I don't want another thing that I need to do. I just love just being with you, and I don't need to even like try to like label it as something. It's like, oh, there's a way for me to prioritize you. Look what I'm doing for you. Like that's not anything like that. It's just like, no, like if I could just choose something to do with my life, with my time, it would just be this. It would just be talking to you, spending time with you. Because I think that even if we didn't have these mics, I think we would just have these conversations, and we're just like now uploading them online for people to, follow. And if they don't want to follow, that's okay. Like it doesn't really matter. And so, yeah, I think, and though I think the side effect of that is that it is going to create some kind of space for both of us. Just a space where we can share, a space that you might feel prioritized. And I know that in the past, one of the things that we did talk about was as ministry started looking a little bit different for me and my pastoral role has been changing. And a lot of the responsibilities and the vision that I had for a pastoral work at a church has changed. It affected you in terms of what your ministry is going to look like. And I think a big part of why we're together or what drew us together, it's not the biggest part, and the big part is that ministry part, and where we want to affect other people's lives. We want to bring other people to Christ, and also walk them through and walk with them through the discipleship journey of their lives, and or through their discipleship journey. And so I think that this could also be a byproduct of that. And I know this might sound horrible. Oh, well, I think this could relate to the second, thing is, I think the purpose of this podcast is not to disciple people, I feel. I think us having these conversations, being filled and being seen by one another, prioritizing our relationship, because I do believe that first is my relationship with God, and then, when we officially have our wedding, that is going to be us too. And once that should be second, right? And above everything. And I think Timothy Keller talks about this, is that when you feel good with your wife, you can tackle the world. But if you are bad, or if you have a bad relationship with your wife, no matter how good your work is, business is, how much money you're making, all of those things just feel futile and feel empty. And so for me too, I see that. I think if our relationship is good, then like everything is good, right?
Yeah.
But if our relationship is out, I can't even do anything. And so I think that it's a way. It's like a means for us to grow closer to one another.
Yeah.
And I think that's just a byproduct of us just doing what we just love together.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I love that. And like, disclaimer, people, like, he's not trying to demean my needs or dismiss. I think and like if they twist it, or like people from outside perspective, they can see it as that, of like, oh, it's like, oh, like it's what I wanted to do. It's not really, I didn't really think about you. But I think of it more as like, when you're sharing, like, I think that can be more pure intended of, I just wanted to spend time with you, instead of like, oh, I did this for you. Like, I intentionally thought this out. And like, in some situations that could be nice, but I think the heart of where it was coming from is like, oh, I just want to spend time with you, and I don't know what it's like exactly gonna look like, but let's just do it together. And so I think I really appreciate and value that aspect, and see the purity of heart behind it. And like, as we're doing this more and more, I see more and more like fruit and like enjoyments of it that we didn't think about. I personally didn't think about, or like expected. Like, even like, we have conversations like this off camera, like in the car all the time while we're eating. Yet I feel like this time of a podcast still brings me a little like ounce more of like deepness, that I learned still so much from you. I'm sure we'll still like continue to learn about each other throughout our lives. And yet, like, when we talked to the podcast, like, oh, I didn't know he was thinking that way. I didn't know he thought of, like, he felt this way about this. And so it's a very good like means to learn more of who you are, and learn about who I am. Like, when you raise a question like, oh, I guess I think about it like this. So it's a time for me to process myself, to learn about you, have fun. And so I think that's why, when off camera, when you're like, what do you think about it? I was like, it's like a multifaceted blessing.
That's right.
Yeah, so it's like the blessing of like our faith growing, talking about ministry, ideas, like emotional like encouragement, our relational building, like fun. That's like maybe financial means.
One day
We'll take any what do you call it? Any PP, what is it? Commercial placements.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it's like a lot to enjoy, and a lot of fruitfulness, and yeah, a lot of things that trail along with it. So
Yeah.
it's good.
Yeah. Yeah, I think one thing that comes to mind while you're sharing was this idea of like, one of the things that I think I often heard was, do it because you want to, not because you have to.
No obligation.
No
Pure
obligation.
desire.
Just because you want to. And I think this is just an example of that. I think this is just purely because I want to. And there are obviously things I'm like, oh, I just have to do it.
I have to. upload and
Right. And I think just this part is I just truly just want to enjoy it with you.
Yeah.
And so I think as we go through the podcast, we probably won't just talk about one thing. We'll talk about all sorts of things. I really want to talk about WoW one day. Man, WoW is so fun.
That's also
WoW
a
is so
blessing.
fun. I know. WoW is so fun.
We're
Except
currently
for
level 70.
yeah, no. Yeah, we really like that.
Except for, you were saying.
Except for the $15 a month membership. Oh my gosh, what's so expensive? Hopefully we can make money here
Product
to
placement.
pay off our debt,
Sponsor us,
our
please.
World of Warcraft debt here. And yeah, I think and one of the things that I did say was that, like, I don't care if people listen to it. It'd be nice. It'd be nice if people listen to it. It's validating. It's fun. But truly, I think I really just want to spend time with you. And so it's just us.
Yeah.
That's why we call it the Us podcast. So that's like the first meaning or reason why we wanted to, or kind of as I was showering, I was like, I got this idea. And I think I
That's
really
why good
like
ideas
it.
come from the shower.
Yes, the Us podcast. And the other reason why I wanted to start the podcast was because us has in the Bible some significant meaning. So if you look at Genesis, the first instance of Trinity is when God says, let us make man in our image. And so this us is referring to the Holy Trinity, the relationship between the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and their perfect communion, self-giving love, self-sacrificial love to one another, and the way that they honor, respect, and love one another, that kind of perfect communion that's infinite, right? That's been eternal. And I want our relationship to reflect that. So it's not just, it's like us reflecting the heavenly us. So that's really another part of that, the Us podcast. So it's as much as it is about us, it's also about us in light of the heavenly us. So I think as we're having these conversations, we're constantly thinking about, like, what would the heavenly us, what would the heavenly us look at and see our lives and our podcast, and I think everything that we say in light of that. And so, and I think it'd be kind of cool, like, as we just journey of our relationship, emulating that kind of loving relationship between the Holy Trinity, and as it relates to our relationship one day with being a married wife and a husband. I think those are all things that I look forward to. And that is why I wanted to call it the Us podcast.
Yes. Yeah, I love that, like, biblical foundation behind it. And it was interesting to learn too of, like, it's like God wasn't, the start of creation was in unity and it was in partnership. It wasn't like God saying, I made. It's let me make. It's let us. And so in a sense, it's like, I think a lot of times I think God being like alone, and like in the before universe was created, it was so like lonely and like mystical and solemn and solitude. But like as you say that, I'm like, maybe it was like creation didn't start from loneliness, but like joy and of like hope of this new life and this new creation. And so it could be a far stretch for us to compare ourselves to God and creation with us on the podcast, but trying to like learn more about God's character. And it's like, yeah, it's like the new things, the creative things is joyful when together, and part of like the enjoyment of life and the essence of who we are, us. And so, yeah, I love that. I love that, like, foundation behind it.
Awesome.
Yeah.
You know, what's interesting, or one thing I noticed as I talk to you, is that there's always like a sparkle in your eye. So I don't know if you're about to cry.
I did get a little emotional.
Okay. I feel like there's always that moment. I'm like, okay,
Yeah.
is she about to cry, or is this her eyes just sparkling? Is
It's
this just
natural.
me?
I just did this and it turns on.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm a very feeling person. So I'm
Sure.
like, wow. While I was sharing, I was processing again and I was like, wow, God is so good. Like God is so amazing. There's so much to learn about him. And so I was like, while I was sharing, I even feel it a little bit now. It's like, wow, that's so good. And so I got a little emotional.
Tell me more about that. What
Yeah.
about it like
Like
touches a
caused it.
chord with you, or touches a string?
I guess to sound fancy, it's like, oh, because I am God's creation, I was made to like worship and delight in who he was. And then just like one dimensional answer is like, God is so amazing. Like I was just in like awe of, wow, that's who God is. And so that was just like my awe, like reverence for, wow, like I guess even from the beginning, like God thought so preciously of us. Like I think I've known it, but now thinking about it, it's like how great must have it been celebrating and like in expectation and desire with Jesus and the Holy Spirit as they're like creating together. So it seems like it's like a more beautiful picture than I thought it to be, instead of like, oh, light. Let there be light. Oh, I just gotta do this. And so I was like, wow, just in awe of our creator.
That's amazing. Yeah. This is that passage. The first time I learned it was through my Bible study teacher. And he's like,
Oh.
hey, did you know that the first instance of the Holy Spirit or the Holy Trinity is in Genesis 1? I was like, what? That's not
Yeah.
true. I was like, yeah, look, it says us and let us make God, or let us make man in our image. I was like, that's trippy, yo.
Yeah.
And then I started like looking into it. I was like, oh my gosh, it does actually say
Yeah,
us, and it
that's
does
so
say we.
cool.
And that's the first evidence of that. Very interesting.
Wow.
And you're right. Like, if you think about the beginning of the world or the universe, you'd imagine this dark void.
Yeah.
And it maybe, I mean, there was void, or like there
Yeah.
was, they were hovering over the waters, right? And at the same time, they were in perfect communion of eternal love for one another
Yeah.
and fellowship.
Yeah. Like cold and empty doesn't always translate to sadness.
Okay, all
Oh
right.
yeah, we're getting there and then we're coming back. But yeah, I was like, wow, there could be warmth without anything.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so good. Um,
Yeah.
well, so yeah, that's the Us podcast, and we'll call it that. And any other thoughts about that before I go into what I've been studying and just be like, oh my gosh.
I'm all ears. Yeah, but go ahead.
All right. So I've been kind of processing some of these objections about faith. I was like, oh man, like should I like actually go into some of these, or should I just let them go and just maybe just pray through it? And I was like, I think maybe I'll just go through it and see what's out there.
Yeah.
And I was like, I'm gonna start with the atheist, or I guess I don't know if he's atheist. His name is Bart Ehrman, and he's, I believe, a New Testament or something, a biblical scholar, right? And so I think he got his PhD from Princeton or something. And so Bart Ehrman, a famous guy who talks about the Bible, but basically he doesn't believe that, or at least, okay, I don't know much about this guy, but I did I did listen to some of his podcasts. I did listen to some of his debates,
Okay.
and some of these argumentations that he has raised up. And so I was very interested in studying through the canonization of the Bible. So canonization is essentially how the Bible was put together. And there were a lot of other books of the Bible that were considered but eventually was rejected and was not canonized. And I believe canonization, or the word canon, means right doctrine or right beliefs, or I forgot. I think Bart Ehrman was like saying it was like a string or something, or like a measure that says this meets the measure and this
Kind
does
of like
not.
a form of law.
Form of law, kind of,
Uh-huh.
and standard, maybe.
Oh yeah, standard.
Yeah. So if it falls, it doesn't belong in the canon. If it meets it, then it belongs in the canon. So there's different criteria that the people who put the Bible together had in order to put the Bible together.
Okay.
And so there were, did you know that, by the way? Did you know that there are other books of the Bible? There's a Gospel of Peter. Yeah, so it says, even though the gospel writers, we don't know, I mean, I still need to study this. We don't know for sure that the gospel writers were Matthew, Luke, John, and Mark. We don't know that.
Yeah.
But this book, apparently, it says that Peter wrote it, like the disciple Peter.
Like outside of First Peter, Second Peter.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So he wrote that book and that gospel. And there's like something about the cross talking or something. Jesus raising. It's like some stuff right there.
Oh yeah.
And so there's like different books that were rejected and accepted based on some criteria, whether it was like apostolic. Apostolic. You know, I can't say agnosticism.
I can't.
Agnosticism.
Agnosticism.
Yeah, I can't say that word for whatever reason.
Agnosticism.
Anyways, apostolic tradition or something, right? So there's some criteria. Now, one of the objections that he raised, and he just kind of passed over it, was this idea of how the canonization process for the Christians were circular. So I was like, okay, like what does he mean by that? And so I went to ChatGPT and I started like having like intense conversation. Yeah, with ChatGPT. And so there's three kind of theories, and there is the intrinsic authority theory, partial something theory, and then the last one was the circular theory. That explains pretty much the canonization of the Bible. And so I probably won't be able to give you the perfect treatment of these three theories because I myself, I'm working through them. And though there are some meat to it that I think I could explain. So the first theory, the self-evident authority theory, says that the Bible or the Gospels, actually before that also, the Gospels, there were certain books that were more core than other books in the Bible. Like, for example, the four Gospels. And even among the four Gospels, there were some that were more accepted than others. And the four Gospels and also the Pauline letters, they were like accepted as like the core books. And so this first theory, what it's saying is that Jesus died, resurrected, and all of these books and Pauline letters basically describes and captures historical events and then just reports them. And therefore, people reading these books, the belief that Jesus is God and both human and God at the same time is self-evident. Means that as soon as they read it, they just know that to be true.
Okay.
It just completely just captures historical events perfectly, and there's no interpretation needed. When somebody reads the Bible, it's just completely self-evident that this is true.
It's like documentary or like news. Even news is a little distorted, like documentary, like facts.
Yeah.
Being pub.
Yeah. Basically, it's like super unbiased. It happened. It just captures it. At least that's my understanding. So that's the first one. But obviously for me, that's not true because I read the Bible and the fact that Jesus was God and he was human was not self-evident to me. And I think maybe reading the Pauline letters a little bit more, and there's had to be some kind of interpretation and some kind of studying that I had to do to come to the conclusion that Jesus was both in God, or
Yeah.
both human and God. And that brings us to the second theory, which is like the partial circular theory, which basically states that they happened and then the people interpret. So this theory is saying that the books, the biblical books, the gospels per se, they had a specific motive and agenda in mind when they were writing the gospels. And I do agree with that because, for example, Mark, it's very full of it really humanizes Jesus, whereas books like John deifies Jesus. And so because it starts, and so there's different agendas. It's not just it happened, it records it.
Yeah.
And therefore it is self-evident.
That is true.
It's no, there is an agenda and there is a specific audience in mind that these four gospels were written. And that doesn't necessarily mean that just because they had an agenda does not mean that the historical fact or the
discounted.
Yeah, just because it was interpretive or it had an element of audience in mind doesn't negate the fact that Jesus's death and resurrection never happened, right? So that's like the partially circular reasoning, and I forgot why it's like exactly circular. It's like it's like basically saying like, okay, the Bible, there's an interpretation of the Bible.
Okay.
And like now books like Hebrew and Revelation, which were not part of the main books, the Gospels, and also the Pauline letters, it was not the main part of those. Now what's happening is that they have an interpretation of the books, and based on this interpretation, they now pick and choose which books are now going to belong in the canon. And so based on this interpretation that Jesus is God and both human and God, now they look at this interpretation and then now they look at Hebrew, and Hebrew is like, okay, it seems like Hebrew, I forgot which exact verse, but says and claims that Jesus is both in God and human. And therefore, because it aligns with our interpretation, we're going to choose Hebrew and we're going to bring him into our canon because it aligns with our interpretation. Now, what happens eventually, I don't know the exact specific things, is that now people look at Hebrew and say, look, Hebrew says that Jesus is God. Therefore, it reinforces this original belief, this original interpretation that came from the Gospels that Jesus is God. So this interpretation, it's like really crazy. This interpretation causes this belief, right? It says you now belong in the canon. But now people come to say that this belongs in the canon because of this belief, and this belief belongs in the canon because of this belief. And so it just becomes this like Hebrew belongs in it because the four gospels, like my interpretation of the four gospels says it. My four interpretation is correct because Hebrew says it. And now it became this circular reasoning where people are saying, well, it's circular, like it's
feeding on
authenticating, I guess, right? And so I was like, okay, is that what Bart Ehrman was saying? And so that's like that second theory. But even if it's circular, right? And this is where I was thinking, it's like there's an interpretation of the Bible saying that Jesus is God and both human and God. So there's that interpretation, and you use that interpretation then to say that other books of the Bible are part of the canon. And people may look at this and say, oh, look, this is a way to then validate the Gospels, right? And then this is the way to validate Hebrew and all the other books. And so it keeps going. But my question was, well, it had to start somewhere.
Yeah.
And it had to start then from
Like, whose belief is that?
Where did their interpretation come from? Well, their interpretation came from the main books of the Bible, the four Gospels, along with the Pauline letters, like the core books. So that's the partial circular theory. And that's what I think I ascribe to. And that's the second one. The third one is Bart Ehrman's argumentation, basically. So, and if he ever watches this, he probably will never. But if I do, I probably am botching up his argument. So, but at least I think
Your takeaway.
my takeaway. And then I have a point to all this, by the way. He is saying, and he comes from, I think, the school of belief that there was the Gospels themselves were an interpretation of the actual facts. So the Matthew, Luke, like all of these guys, they were interpreting the actual event in a way that makes most sense to them and their own theological beliefs and making sense of who Jesus was, so on and so forth. So it describes like an event, but it is completely interpretive. And they have their own agendas. And I don't know Bart Ehrman would argue, say that like maybe the death happened, but the resurrection did not happen, right? And so there's this interpretation, and then now people get this interpretation and then add another layer of interpretation because now they interpreted what happened with Jesus. That's an interpretation. And then people then go and interpret the Bible. So there's a double layer of interpretation, which I guess the partial circular reasoning also has that element to it too. But basically he is saying that these are just all interpretations. And there were some kind of like other belief systems at the time that were trying to vie for authority. So there's like Gnosticism and there were some other beliefs, and they were all trying to gather like authority so that they can say that they are, I guess, the winners. And so, but what he is saying was that there was never really any authority in terms of reality. It just was the social, cultural, political thing that solidified the canonization of the Bible. It just was merely perspectives and theological beliefs that people just had that has no correlation to this belief. And the only reason why the Christian belief is a proto-orthodoxy or something. That is like what we believe right now. So proto-orthodoxy, the reason why it won out wasn't because that it was actually true and that these things happened.
It was just popular.
It was more popular and there were more people defending it and there were more like ascribed to that belief. So there was a wider like belief and acceptance of that belief. And also like Constantine or something like said that now this is the belief that everybody's gonna believe. He made it like a state thing. And so they just had more structure, political and social and cultural power that made it so that it won out and then became what we believe in today. And so I was like studying all this. I was like, oh my gosh. And so I was like, now that I kind of understand the different theories, which by the way, this was from ChatGPT, so don't take my word for it, but I could see why these theories exist, right? And so what he is now saying, well, before I go into what I'm about to say, any thoughts?
At first I was a little overwhelmed of like, oh, it's this kind of thinking. But I still love this kind of space with you. I remember we were talking about what is zero. It's kind of like that space, but
very much philosophical.
Yes. And so it was still interesting to learn because like, not to discredit myself, but I know I would not have as much of a chance as for me to study into that as you would have. I think I would have been like, oh, like, because I have thoughts of like, yeah, like why is the Bible in this order? like why are these certain books? And it's like sometimes they say like, oh, we don't know who wrote this book. Like why?
Yeah.
And like even the facts or the details of the different stories and how like some like focus on others, like the gospels, like they focus on a different aspect, like but it's the same story. Like who are these people who are writing this? And like you're saying, who are the people who decided to put the Bible together? Because ultimately a man had to physically bring these copies together, go through this thinking of what is considered the standard or what is considered the belief of why these all put together. Whether it's God speaking to them or whether it's a group of people who all agreed, it's like there is a question of why. And I know you love that question,
Oh, yeah.
why. And so it is still like edifying in my own faith to learn about. So yeah, I'd love to hear more.
Yeah. I think one thing that I do need to get better at is like with the details. I mean, I mean, I try to like study church history, but it's so boring.
Yeah.
But I think if I study it this way, I think it's going to be a little bit more meaningful because I have a problem and I'm trying to solve the problem. In order for me to solve this problem, I have to know a little bit more church history because like you were saying, there were like a lot of people think that it was the Council of Nicaea or something in something AD, like several hundred years after. That's where all these bishops and people, big names of Christendom came together and made the decision and
So
to
it wasn't the
canonize the Bible.
disciples. It wasn't like the actual
No,
people who wrote him.
no. It was some other guy. I forgot the
Whoa.
name. But yeah,
Oh, that's interesting.
it wasn't these bishops and Council of Nicaea. I think that came from this movie called The Da Vinci Code, like a while back. And so people had this, and I've watched that movie, but I couldn't speak English back then. So like I didn't know what it was saying. And so it's something like that. And I think in Council of Nicaea, they were addressing the problem of Armenianism. And so that's another like heretical belief. And so they were addressing that. I think they also decided on the date of Easter, yeah, or something like that. So they didn't talk about the canonization of the Bible then.
Oh.
Yeah, I think it came at a different time.
Yeah.
So anyways, so the canonization of the Bible. So now I was like thinking, okay, now that I understand different kind of theories out there, and okay, so which one is the most viable one? And I think the reason why Bart Ehrman he keeps, or it just seems that no matter what, he is going to follow a natural reason to give a natural explanation for whatever has happened with Christianity. So whether it's social, whether it's political, because it cannot be rooted in reality that Jesus died and resurrected. I think he himself, because of his, it was, so it's not like, sorry, Bartman, if you're ever listening to this, I don't think that he is actually, I think he is circularly reasoning. And the reason why is because he enters this conversation with the belief that supernatural things cannot happen. And because he enters the conversation with that belief, he needs to find a way to explain this
I see what you
without
mean.
supernatural causes. So he needs to explain it in the light of political, social, cultural reasons. And so I was like, right? He needs to explain it in that way. Because if it now, he enters into the conversation with the belief that it is possible, then I think we could definitely have a different perspective or a different way of seeing things potentially. And other than natural causes or natural explanations for the cause of Christianity. And so he's actually circular. And the reason why is he is saying that supernatural things cannot happen. Look at Christianity. Christianity is can be explained by natural causes. Look, therefore, it shows that look at all the explanation, that social political stuff, and look, that now it reinforces, and Jesus actually didn't rise from the dead. It was all social, whatever political stuff. Now that informs his belief that nothing supernatural can happen, and only natural things can happen. Maybe it's not super circular, but for me at the moment, I was like, maybe
Yeah.
is he circular? Maybe at least maybe if he's not circular, he is already entering into the conversation with the assumption of the thing that cannot be disproven. So we're not actually talking about, like, no matter what happens with this data, that's not going to change this underlying assumption and this belief that there's no such thing as supernatural causes. As long as that remains, everything has to be understood from a natural cause.
Yeah.
And that's why I think it's so problematic.
Yeah.
And so when people listen to this stuff and they're like, well, it seems like he's got pretty natural explanations for this. Well, he's going to have a natural explanation for this. It's because he has a belief that there's no supernatural causes in this world. If we address that, there could be very good chance that he can look at this, okay, if supernatural things can happen, then it is true. It could be true that the best possible explanation for all of this is the actual death and resurrection of Jesus. So that came to my mind.
Oh, that's very fascinating. It's like you're raising the point of we're not having a conversation. We're each saying our own story in two different rooms. So how would we ever meet in the middle if all we're doing is pacing in each of our own rooms?
Yeah.
Like this belief that the believer side is like, what I see in the Bible is to be true. And that's our natural reasoning of like, oh, this is what it says. And there's manuscripts to prove it. There's like other like historical events that like coincide. And yeah, that's what is science. Like it coincides. This is what is true. And there's this belief that I have a belief in the supernatural. And then if you go in the other room, it's like, oh, I don't believe in the supernatural. But it's like I do use reasoning, but also there isn't enough factual evidence to prove that there is no supernatural being.
Yeah.
So it's like using the same method, I guess,
Yeah.
with different statements.
Yeah.
And so the point is to meet a compromise, but it's like we're each saying our own story on each side.
Absolutely.
So like how would, like you're saying, the problem is how would we ever meet in the middle and figure out what it is?
Yeah. And, I think you're right in terms of like people being in different rooms and their foundation is that, well, I don't know if it's like foundational because I think, okay, so here's, I think, a thought that came to mind as you were saying. People can use the data of Jesus's death and resurrection and the eyewitness accounts and how the disciples' life changed after their encounter with Jesus' death and resurrection and how they gave their lives for all that stuff. And then just the explosion of Christianity after that. They can look at that and that people can see that and say, hey, that is evidence for the fact that there is something supernatural out there. So they don't even necessarily need to come into the conversation with the belief that supernatural things can happen. They don't need to come with that belief. They can just they're agnostic about it. They're like, I don't know if supernatural things happen, nor I think it could be that everything's just naturalism. But when they now look at the data, they're like, oh, it seems like the best possible explanation for the data that I see is that Jesus has resurrected from the dead. And therefore, supernatural things can happen.
Yeah.
Therefore, now this agnosticism that they had, I said it right, I think, now it tips over to supernaturalism, right? Now, I think the problem with Bart Ehrman is this. He sees this, but it's not he sees this and therefore determines whether you're a supernaturalist or a naturalist. I think he comes with, I'm a naturalist. Therefore, it must be natural. So he is already coming up with an assumption that no matter what happens with this data is not going to change his mind.
I
He needs,
see.
I think,
Yeah.
once again, sorry, Bartman. I think what he needs to do is he needs to let go of this and look at the data itself and say, is it possible? Because as long as you come up with, hold this assumption that it's only natural, then it will never change your thought, right? And I think that's what we have to recognize about Bart Ehrman. He's a naturalist and therefore looks at the data with a natural lens. And then now when people listen to this, like, oh, it makes sense, or it could like potentially be the case that it could be explained by natural causes. Well, he's presenting a case where it's not like there's no other option for him to present the natural reason. That's it. That's all he has, because he has to. He holds on to this belief, right? And so, yeah, I think I just want people to know that people like, I don't know, like people like Bart Ehrman, because I'm sure there are people like Bart Ehrman, is that they're not, I don't know if they're like, I don't know. I don't know. I don't want to go as far as to say this, but I think it's just my heart is that they're looking at the data is not as objective as you think it is. There is a bias and a stance they hold that they look at this data. And I think when people like read and say stuff, it's like, well, wow, that makes sense. And I think they think that like, oh, he came to these conclusions just purely by studying the text and like I think he just came to these conclusions because of just absolute textual evidence. I don't know if that's necessarily true. And I hope that one day I get to meet him and we can talk about this stuff. I think what he is doing is he's once again holding the view and then figuring out a way to weave naturalism in there to explain the data. So it's not unbiased, it's biased. And so, but who knows? He might not hold that belief in the first place.
Yeah.
But I think whether it's Bart Ehrman or not, other people, other philosophers, or other people who might hold this kind of belief, like, I just want people to understand that. Like, these people might just come from a naturalistic assumption. And of course, they're going to find natural ways of explaining things. They're not putting the text first. They're putting their assumption first and then interpreting. Rather, it should be, let's look at the text first and then see what happens. So yeah, what time is it? 52 minutes. All right.
Wow. Yeah. I think I just want to say, like, I think I'm just grateful and happy that you can be excited and so like happy to like share like, you know, your thoughts and your ideas. I see you like come alive.
Yeah. Well, that's
And
fun.
like to do all that studying, like I feel like I would have spent like 5 minutes and be like, oh, like
Yeah.
even when I study on Paul and all his like years, his dates are like off. I'm like, what was this? Is this his second missionary journey? What was this? Is this a second imprisonment? Like, how old is he? Like, I'm already tired looking up that one factual evidence. And so I think it's very like honorable that you like, if I have a question, I will get to the root of it. Like you said, problem, I will find the answer.
Yeah.
And like kind of stepping your brain thinking into Bart Ehrman's thinking and like trying to understand him and like point out like the differences. And I know like maybe it could be heavy for a little certain people. So while you were sharing, I was like, you know, and like you can even use that thinking in a more general sense of like, do you believe everything you see? Like even that general question of like media or like when someone tells you something, like do you believe them based on their words or do you search for evidence? And when you see the evidence, do you still believe them? So like I think that can apply to like maybe cheating in relationships, or it could be like I don't know, so many different like court context or I don't know. And so I was like, oh yeah, that's very like a good inner reflection to have. Like, what are my beliefs and what do I place my values? And is it this like unfounded thoughts that I just believe to be true? Have I ever thought why they're true? And what's the value of those things existing and why do I think that way? I think, yeah, so it raised very like generic and yet very relatable questions as well. So I just wanted to validate and expand.
Thank you. Yeah, I think the question of why is important and getting to the root cause. And so it's not letting just these thoughts just be thoughts. And I think it's okay sometimes. And I think doubts can grow. And so I think just finding answers, your own answers to these is important. I'm curious as to what your thoughts are on the actual argument.
Argument?
Yeah, like about what like Bart Ehrman was saying about like this natural cause of like his assumption that he held, and then then painting that natural cause explanation for everything that's happening. What are your thoughts on that?
I think at least for now, it's like that's the only evidence or like information I have. And so I think I see how you're saying he's also coming from an unfounded belief of he's arguing for natural reasoning, but is it really natural reasoning or is it this belief that will not be shaken by natural explanations, like real explanations or evidence instead of explanations? And so I was like, oh, I think I agree with that and I can see that. And then I think my question would only be like, what are the specific examples to like why he argues it to be natural? And then versus like what exactly in the Bible ordains it to be true? So maybe this is another like side topic from what you're sharing, but yeah, that's what's in my head. So I think your argument is like very like creative, and I was like, wow, how can he think about that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think I've heard these types of argumentation, like from Timothy Keller and other like philosophers. And so definitely not mine. I think I just made the connection. I was like, oh, I think this is what he is actually doing. And so, yeah. Yeah. And I think one of the reasons why I am more motivated to do this stuff is because my conversation with Michael, he said that he is still open to evidence. And then he's like, I've done my own research and it seems to me that there's no real good explanation for Christianity. But if there is out there, like I'm open to changing my beliefs. And I think because of that, I was like, oh, okay, let's do this, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think that's another reason.
Yeah. I'd love to learn like the Christian like biblical evidence too. Yeah. Maybe we can have another podcast where we like actually discuss like historical facts and evidence.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it is. Yeah, it is pretty contested, it feels like. And like we talked about, it's not decisive. And I think with my like study, I think it's going to be different if I ever talk to him though. Right. I think he's going to be able to like justify himself and like actually give me his like responses, which I would absolutely love. And I would love to be corrected, and I would love to get to the truth of things. I think that would be really fun. One day.
Yeah.
One day we'll invite him if he ever cares to come on our podcast.
Sorry, Michael. Maybe you can bring Melody with him.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Any last thoughts before we end today?
No, it was all good. Yeah.
Thank you for listening.
Of course. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, I think in the beginning I was like, okay, there's a point to this, I promise. And so, yeah. All right. Episode 6. We're done.
Yes.
Have a great rest of your day.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
YOLO lo 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 lo. YOLO lo 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 lo.
Bye.
Bye-bye.